All right, well, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get rolling because I know everybody's busy and has a lot to do. My name is Kirk Curnutt, and I'm the managing editor of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. And we appreciate you joining us for this little workshop on academic writing and publishing that we've put together. Uh, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists, but if you have any questions or anything you want to ask, just go ahead and you can either jump in the Q&A or the chat. I will monitor those as we go along. Joining us today, we're still waiting on one person, and I think there may have been some confusion thanks to Zoom and their inability to tell people what time zones to pretend that they live in, but we're going to go ahead and roll anyway. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, starting with the Z's, because I know they always feel like they come last on the list. So Lee Zimmerman teaches and writes on 20th century American literature, psychoanalysis, literature, and eco-criticism. And his most recent publications include Against Depression, Final Knowledge, and Styron, Mayers, and Solomon, study of contemporary nonfiction depression narratives, and essays on Elizabeth Bishop and Frankenstein, in light of object relations and psychoanalysis. He's currently working on a study of trauma theory and global warming. And most importantly for our purposes, he's the editor of 20th Century Literature, which is published by Duke University Press.
That study is now published, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Do you want to give us the title of that real quick?
Yeah, sure. It's Trauma and the Discourse of Climate Change, Literature, Psychoanalysis, and Denial. It's Routledge.
Okay, fantastic. I know we our university websites never really regularly update. James Long holds a BA in English from the honors program at St. Mary's University, as well as an MA and a PhD in English from Louisiana State University, and his dissertation, Revolutionary Republics, won the Josephine A. Roberts Alumni Association Distinguished Dissertation Award in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. He's published academic articles on James Conrad, James Fenimore Cooper, and Herman Melville, as well as journalism profiling arts and music events in Louisiana, and I can attest he has impeccable taste in music. He's also the acquisitions editor at Louisiana State University Press, and he manages series and meetings in public affairs, Southern Lit, American Wars and Pop Culture, and New Hispanisms, sorry. Suzanne del Gizzo is professor of English and chair of the Center for Integrated Humanities at Chestnut Hill College. And she's the editor of the Hemingway Review, which she's managed for about 5 years now. At Chestnut Hill, she teaches a variety of courses in American literature, gender, film, and writing. She's published more than 20 articles in scholarly journals and co-edited 3 books, Ernest Hemingway in Context, Ernest Hemingway's Garden of Eden, and the New Hemingway Studies. And the Hemingway Review is unique in that the society owns and manages it, and Suzanne has really the driving force behind that. So that may be something we get into as well. And finally, but not certainly not least, is Aurora Bell, who's the acquisitions editor at the University of South Carolina Press, where in addition to acquiring regional sorry, I'm checking my email. At the same time, regional trade and literary studies, she oversees 2 very important series, Understanding Contemporary Literature, which I believe Lynda Wagner Martin still sort of edits, and Movement Rhetorics/Rhetorics Movement. Before joining USC 2 years ago, she served as acquisitions editor at Countryman Press, an NYC Norton imprint, and she holds degrees in comparative literature and French from New York University. So thank you guys for being here today. I really appreciate your time. So I'm going to start with our journal editors, and just right off the bat, tell us what is the most common mistake that comes with a submission that will get us rejected immediately. Suzanne or Lee, you want to?
Go ahead, Suzanne.
Rejected immediately, I guess at the Hemingway Society or the Hemingway Review, the biggest issue we have is, that some people are aficionados exclusively. And so I would say the number one reason we reject pieces is that they're not sufficiently scholarly. And it's a really great problem to have, because one of the tricks of that particular journal is to embrace our wide audience. We love that we are not just read exclusively by scholars, but also by aficionados. I think it's one of the great challenges to publish that journal in a very readable, accessible voice, but still with sufficient scholarly rigor. So that's one of the challenges at our journal, but also one of the unique and I think important things that we try to walk the line on and do there.
Great, thank you. Lee?
So the question of why something would be rejected immediately is somewhat different than why it would be rejected non-immediately. But to answer the immediate question, a variety of things. We get, for instance, a lot of international submissions, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, we get a really lot. And a lot of them, you can tell that the writer isn't a native English speaker. And it presents a lot of problems in terms of what it would mean to publish it.
Sure.
So that's one sort of immediate problem. Another would be if it's somewhat too narrow for a journal like TCL, which for the most part tries to address questions beyond, of a certain scope. Mm-hmm. So those would be, I guess, the two main reasons why it would be rejected out of hand.
I'm curious if either of you have seen a trend lately. We've had a lot of essays submitted that are 18,000 words or 15,000 words, and it feels like it's just really obviously a dissertation chapter coming straight to us. And I don't know if you guys have had that problem, but there's just no way economically a journal can devote that much space to a single issue. Used to be we were 5,000 words of submission, and that nowadays people can't really. I think 7,500 to 10,000 is the norm, but nothing over 10,000. James and Aurora. So I think there's a mystery out there about how presses develop a list. And can you tell us what goes into that? And more specifically, how do I figure out if my magnum opus is appropriate for your list?
I would say a logical place to start is just look at books that the press has published that you own or that you enjoy, and just to see, what kind of books are on the list that you think your own work would be in good company with, in good conversation with. Because in terms of like building and developing lists, I would say that, we're looking for projects that fit our existing strengths, the areas that we have along, that we regularly publish in. But also always looking for projects that kind of develop and build on the list in interesting directions, because that's much easier for us than, say, like trying to branch off and start over from scratch, publishing in a new field where, we have to figure out like what journals to advertise in, and our production people might have to, figure out how to handle certain types of material and so forth. So I would say and I often find it helpful in like query letters, if people mention, books that we published that they think, is a good comp or a good, predecessor of what they're doing.
Great. Aurora?
Yeah, I'd add maybe a timeline element to that response, saying, if there's a book that you love that we published that was foundational, but it's from 1995, then make sure, that we're still building on that area of research. So looking at either the press's website or recent catalogs, which are usually posted, can be really helpful as well. And then at least in my case, I would say not to be afraid to send query letters, to sort of go a little bit towards the journal question. One of the big reasons for rejection, I would say, is just that something isn't a good fit. And so it has nothing to do with the quality of the project. It's just that we're not the right home. And with those conversations, I always want to stress that it's not about us not wanting the project. It's about us wanting the author to find a better partner for it. So exactly what James was saying about, do we have relationships with the right journals to promote this book in, and all of those other things. And if we don't, someone else will in this academic publishing landscape. So definitely don't hesitate, I think, to put together a well-crafted query letter and say, based on some of the things you've published before, X, Y, and Z books, I think this could be a great fit, but I recognize those are a little bit older. Is this still a direction you're going in, or what are you looking for now? I think having those conversations early can be very valuable.
Great. Yeah, I think the thing to emphasize is rejection is not the end of the world. None of us are too good for rejection. We get it all the time, and it really isn't personal. You can have an impeccable manuscript or project, and as Aurora says, it just doesn't suit the strength of the press. So we have a question already, and this kind of leads into the next one I was going to ask Lee and Suzanne is, what is sufficient scholarly rigor?
Suzanne, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, it was something I said, so I feel a little put on the spot. I think one of the main things that I'm looking for, and this is actually a really interesting challenge, I'd be curious to see what Lee says, is I want the author to be in dialogue with existing scholarship, to demonstrate a knowledge of the conversation that's already happening. And it's fun to count how many drinks are in The Sun Also Rises. But if that's what you do, and then you just send an article on that without any other sort of context, about alcohol and The Sun Also Rises, that's what I mean by lacking sufficient scholarly rigor. But I will say there's a danger side on the other side of that as well, where I'm getting articles that summarize scholarship for about 12 pages before I see what it is they're trying to argue. So that right balance and feeling yourself authentically in conversation with existing scholarship is what I personally meant by sufficient scholarly rigor. Thanks.
Yeah, Suzanne nailed one of the main things there, I think. It's, for me, can you define the conversation in which you're intervening, and can you define the nature of your intervention? Another way of putting that is, what question are you addressing? Now, establishing the context for that question in relationship to previous scholarship is an art. Obviously, you need to marshal the proper context. And one of the difficult things is how to turn the so-called lit review into a useful construction that sets out a context for the question that you want to address. That's an art, as is then negotiating between establishing that theoretical or historical or critical context and the close reading. It's not unusual to find close readings that are not especially expressive of their relationship to that context. nor is it at all unusual to find a decently set out context with a decently set out question with close readings that are too cursory or something like that. I feel all this stuff is in some way obvious enough, but maybe it's worth articulating.
It's very difficult. I think one of the worst things for English that ever happened was we had that notion back in the day of the review of literature section, and that implied that there was either a section or at least a paragraph in there where you sort of went through an overview of what had been said, as opposed to using that criticism either to support your argument or contrast it to. So you definitely want to, demonstrate proficiency in the area. So for James and Aurora, I'm curious, what would you say the biggest mistake, and let's say A, in terms of writing, but B, in terms of professionalism, that you run into with authors? And by that, I mean, has anybody just ever lost it with you on a rejection? I think, that's one of the to be able to be rejected gracefully is a, as a humbling thing, but, and it doesn't always happen very well. So either of you want to take that one?
I would say one thing that can sort of maybe hasten us to turn something away is like repeated follow-ups. Like if someone sends in a query or proposal, and we acknowledge receipt and say, I've received your proposal. I hope to have some feedback for you in 4 to 6 weeks. If every week after that there's some sort of follow-up email with maybe like an additional piece of material or a revised chapter or something, that can just get really tedious, and it clogs up everyone's email. Yeah, I mean, I have had some people lose it with me. One of my, I don't want to, maybe like I'll hold off on sharing some of the juicier anecdotes, but I did have someone write a poem once. And it actually arrived several months after I had rejected the manuscript. And the poem actually mentioned that they'd send me a copy of the book when it appeared, which I'm still waiting for, but that's...
That sounds like they may have had some other issues going on. I was just heard from Lynda, so she'll be joining us in just a sec. And it was a time zone issue. So Aurora, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll chime in maybe more on the writing side, which I think one of the big things we see is insufficiently revised dissertations. So the comments that our friends from the journal side were making about lit reviews are a big part of that insufficient revision. I think that we often get much too much in the form of lit review, and for the book, you need to, again, demonstrate that you're part of this conversation, because the other people who read your book are part of that conversation, and they want to know how you're building on it and interacting, but not to be doing that in a way that's just proving that you've read all the right books. So that's a big thing. And I think sort of hand in hand with that is some of the sort of writing style issues that we see in a dissertation that are just not necessary in a book. You can trust your reader to just follow you along through the chapter without telling us what we're going to encounter in the next section of this chapter, and that kind of thing. And then also with how footnotes or endnotes rather are deployed. I usually tell authors, take a good look at all of your notes, and if it's something that you need someone to read, it should really be in the body of your book. And if it's unimportant enough that if they miss it, nothing is lost, then it probably shouldn't be in the book. I think that the way that online journals are accessed now is really beautiful in terms of how easy it is to see those notes while you're reading. But we have to remember that in a book, they will be endnotes and you will have to turn, 200 pages
Yeah,
to see them. So that sort of use is very different.
that's
And
great.
something to keep in
That
mind.
really addresses well an issue that just came up in the chat about that lit review about where it should go. And the reality is I think as both you and Lee are suggesting, it should set a bit of a context, but it should not feel like I'm reeling off a work cited in a paragraph. It's it needs to sort of illuminate your own argument. Lynda is here, and my apologies. I do not know what time zone you're in, so you're on mute if you want to take the mute off. But I'll just go ahead and ask you, because we were kind of talking this about our emails, about what you think the biggest mistake a submitter to Arizona Quarterly can make that will get you an immediate desk rejection.
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And I want to apologize for joining everyone late. I knew it was a 3-hour difference, but somehow I thought 11 o'clock was 3 hours away from 1 o'clock. Pandemic brain. So anyhow, so when you say immediate desk reject, that sort of sounds like, off with their heads. And that's really not the spirit in which we do these things. And I know you guys know that, but I just wanted our audience to know that. There are things you can do that indicate that you simply have not done your homework before you submitted to our journal. One thing is that it would be an article that simply do not publish. There's a website, it says what we're interested in and what kinds of things we publish. And it's really, partly because people are desperate and partly because they're so busy, we get an astonishing number of submissions that have nothing to do with American literature. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in the work cited has to be, red, white, and blue or anything like that. But, anything has to intersect in some significant way with the field of US, American, North American, some kind of Irkin conversation. The other thing that people do that in an amazing amount of time. We don't like it when people say, "Oh, here's an article that's in a Martian bibliographic or format system, and if you like it and take it, then we'll fix it later." That you have to be extremely compelling to get past that mistake. So otherwise, immediate desk rejects don't really happen that often. We always try to read things, but we stop reading 2 sentences in if you've submitted something to us that's basically about, Latvian law practices or something like that. Okay.
Great.
A more considered desk reject you would get, unless that's a separate topic.
No, go ahead.
Okay. We have to desk reject things that we know will not will irritate our readers. I mean, people who read for journals they're doing what used to be known as, and probably still is known as, women's work. They're working for love, not money. They get very little recognition, and they spend hours and hours doing this professional courtesy for us. It's really paying forward, backward, and sideways what they do. So if we receive a submission that spends a few pages at the beginning, I'm not making this up either, telling us all about what it's going to talk about and why we should be interested, it's very unlikely that I'm going to bother my readers with it. I might make a comment or two, but I'm not going to try to send that one out because it'll take too much editing anyway, and they're not going to want to wade through those first few pages. Grammatical errors. Yeah. Refusal to submit in the way we need you to submit. I've had people copy their entire articles into a personal email to me. Yeah, it's not an outlier. That wasn't only once. So those kinds of things. But if you read the website, note what the journal publishes. You just glance at some table of contents. You're really not likely to get a desk reject. The other way you get a desk reject is if you're writing about something nobody else. This happened recently. Nobody in our professional acquaintance, did it. And so there's this kind of originality fetish we fall into sometimes. And we do get essay. I'm sure you all do. We get submissions that say, "I'm the first one to ever think of this, and I don't know why all you idiots haven't." Those kinds of gestures are sort of amateurish.
Yeah.
But if you've actually discovered something no one's ever talked about, where do I send it? And why would I want to publish it? I mean, journals are in the business of forwarding academic conversations. So you need to find an article will get desk rejected if it hasn't located itself. This is desk rejected with consideration of the value of the piece. Will get desk rejected pretty much out of hand if it's not a part of any kind of ongoing critical conversation. That doesn't mean it has to be a conversation that started yesterday. But you have to be aware that it's a dinner table. It's a dinner party. Right.
Those are great points, and I love that comment about sort of not calling attention to yourself as being the only person on earth who's had the genius to realize this or discover this. Because when I read a scholarly book, there's nothing that irritates me more, and it's usually wrong for somebody to sort of boast about something like that. So there's a great question for James and Aurora in the chat, and it's from Steve Paul, who has a biography of Evan Connell coming out from Missouri. And he says his book was categorized as scholarly rather than a trade book. And he's kind of curious about what decisions go into making that determination or putting us in one category or the other. Either of you care to take that one on? Recognizing that you're not speaking for that specific example.
Sure. I would just say that there are a lot of factors that go into that, and that I know and with our marketing department now is actually saying that, and just in terms of the financial end for us, some of the distinction between like the trade treatment and the scholarly treatment is sort of dissolving to some extent. And so a lot of times a trade versus scholarly treatment might just come down to like what type of discount we might need to give it for our sales reps. And so, trade books for us are primarily books that would be like, say, on sale in bookstores that our sales reps are going to be, having kind of pushing in that way. Whereas, we can have a book that has a scholarly discount and is getting a scholarly treatment, but is still, priced. But if we think it has the potential for, an audience outside of just academics, we can price it accordingly and treat it in that way, even though it's technically still labeled a scholarly book. But that's also the kind of question that, I would just encourage someone to talk about with not only their editor, but also like the marketing contacts at the press, because marketing are really the folks that do a lot of the work on that end.
Great. Aurora?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can bring in the example of our Understanding Contemporary American Literature series. That's a place where everything is technically a scholarly book, but we do publish in simultaneous paperback and hardcover editions. And so those paperbacks, we are trying to sell them to the appropriate trade bookstores, and it gets a little maybe too complicated for this venue, but everything those books that are sort of tagged as scholarly have their lower discount that we give on scholarly books, but then if they go into a trade bookstore, that account's actually getting a trade discount on it as sort of, that's the only way they take it. So it's a little special extra for them. So there's a lot of things, as James was saying, that really float in an in-between space. And the way that we label it initially is based on where we think the majority of the audience is going to be, if it's scholars versus people shopping in a bookstore. But beyond that, there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of variation we can make. On our Southern history list, a lot of that comes with both how accessible the scholarship is, but also sort of micro-regional distinctions. So if we have something even that's very serious, but it's about Charleston, then we're going to look at it in a slightly different way because we're here in South Carolina and we can sell a lot of books to tourists in Charleston who, you know, may buy something even though it is pretty serious scholarship. So there's a lot of sort of gray area between those academic and trade distinctions.
Great, great. So again, it's not personal if you get categorized one way or another, and it doesn't mean you're going to get any less attention in either category. There is a question that I'll go ahead and ask our two acquisitions editors too that is in the chat. Do you consider an author's biography when evaluating their manuscript? In other words, as higher education shifts and there are more and more or fewer and fewer tenure track jobs, you get a submission from somebody who's who's maybe an independent scholar or somebody who's in a non-traditional role. Does that affect your willingness to consider their manuscript at all?
Not at all. I think we're interested in the quality of the work, and you know, we're going to look at the proposal, see how it's positioned in the scholarly literature, see what journals pieces of it have appeared in. So,
Aurora, I know you're in kind of the unique position of you're working with a dead guy basically on a project. So I think if you are willing to work with those who have passed on, you're willing to work with just about anybody. But do you have a significant number of authors that are maybe outside the profession?
On our scholarly list, I wouldn't say that we have a significant number outside of the profession, but we certainly have a significant number outside of tenure track positions. We have a lot of faculty members at community colleges and also people in lecturer positions and other things and postdocs who we publish. So certainly that distinction within the academy is not something we're too concerned about. Just as James said, if the author is demonstrating that through their journal publishing, they're engaged with the conversations and they're at this dinner party, that's the main thing that we're going to care about there. But I do also publish a lot of books for a general audience. And in those cases, I have a lot of authors who are experts in ways that may not include a PhD and may not be associated with the university in any way at all.
Great, great. So the long and short is, as long as it's professional, it will be considered. And I know that's true for most journals too. I do want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about, especially with our journal editors, about the writing voice, because I think the biggest challenge is establishing the kind of the authoritative voice. And part of doing that is assimilating what to some people is the language or the terminology of a particular approach or a particular audience is expecting for it to sound professional, but to other readers may sound like jargon. So I'm wondering, is there some kind of distinction that we can figure out between what is the language of the profession, or how do we know when we're using jargon, I guess would be my general question.
Well, I'll take a stab. I mean, we're always using jargon, one sort or another. It's just a question of what our community of readers defines as normalized jargon and what isn't. the question is the writing fluid? And whatever the diction is it fluid, and does it make a coherent argument as it goes? I was very influenced in grad school by Richard Lanham, who wrote an incredible book called Revising Prose. And I still, as I'm working with texts, have a disinclination toward to-be verbs and excessive nominalization. You know, if I'd said one of the main problems with so-called academic writing, one of the questions you asked, is that it doesn't use actual verbs for the most part, that it relies so heavily on these high-sounding nominalizations that it just becomes dead. So one thing I always do in my own writing is, after I finish a paragraph or something, and certainly as I'm editing a piece, you know, how many to-be verbs are there? Are there actual verbs in the sentence that will give the sentence some life? So those questions come to the fore for me, as opposed to questions of diction or jargon per se. Often, if you put a nominalization into a verb, that'll solve the so-called diction problem or the jargon problem.
Great. That's excellent. That's really fantastic advice. Suzanne?
I would say a version of that, which is a difficult argument is different than difficult writing, you know, and that a difficult argument is a joy to read. It's a challenge to read, but difficult writing is not. And so I think, you know, to say something very commonsensical, if it can be said in a simpler way, do that. But if it can't, then write it really well, and you know, make sure it's full of that vigorous prose and that clarity, and that the reason why you are expressing yourself the way you are is sort of made visible to the reader. And I think, as an aside, another issue is also which journal, you know, and who is the audience of that journal. So different journals will have different sweet spots with jargon, or, you know, maybe highly theoretical language. And in our case, you know, the Hemingway Review is focalized around, or you know, focalized around an author, Hemingway. So our readers will have a tolerance for a wide range of perspectives, but we have to watch how theoretical or how deep into any one jargon we go. But I think that's different depending on the publication, obviously. So,
Right. Lynda, do you want to try that? And I might just add there, is there a particular literary term that when you see it, you just kind of groan?
Oh, I'm not certain that I should reveal that level of trade secret, you know, because I'm often caught out by my own intolerances. You know, I'll see something and I'll say, oh my God. And then I start reading it and I'm totally taken by the piece. But however, I don't give up my internal prejudice. The next time I see the same word, I might, I'd prefer not to confess to that as so much. But I'd like to underscore and you know, affirm what both Lee and Suzanne have just said. I mean, I think that is some excellent, fabulous advice to people. The way I would frame my particular, as a broad field and a broad methodology journal, I mean, we're very open to virtually everything. So the notion that if it can be said in a more simple way, that is what we would like you to do, is very important in that context. We can't get into dueling vocabularies in our shop. That said, it's also very important to acknowledge, you know, Sigmund Freud said it, you know, I'm often asked to put it more simply. I can't, because it's not more simple. So sometimes the vocabulary is necessary. And I think a touchstone that writers could use, and I think the verb issue is an excellent one, but another touchstone is that notion, again, of an academic conversation among peers. what conversations or what intersections among and between academic conversations do you propose to join? Those conversations have persistent, you can call it jargon, but maybe we could call it expert terminology that they use not instead of an argument, but because it's crucial to make that complex argument that Suzanne was talking about. So if you can run a test on it yourself. This is a test I run on myself. If I can say, if I can write the sentence back in regular, more or less academic English without the specialty words, A, that means I understand it. And B, that means more people than just the people who use that vocabulary are also going to have fun. Because this is, despite all the horriblenesses that surround us and the dreadful state of the profession in terms of fairness to people in their employment status. And by the way, we do not pay any attention to submitters' academic or employment status whatsoever. We're in a glorious profession. We get to play with words. We get to have complex conversations. We get to read shit that we really like, So if the writer's focus is less on trying to look worthy and more on, being a sort of, a Virginia Woolf dinner host, proprietor, or whatever term you want to use for that, if you focus on intending to further a conversation, okay, and open up your own argument to other angles as well, I think you're on the right track. And nobody's perfect. I mean, I have a fabulous copy editor on the journal, and he catches people out regularly, but in a good way. Listen to your editor. They make you a better writer, and when they kill your favorite sentence, thank them.
That's great advice. And I should mention that, the Fitzgerald Review, when we finished our 2020 issue, we sent it to our production people. The first draft had almost 600 corrections in it. So, that's the sort of line edit sort of intensity that I think we all go through. And I know I speak for Lee and Suzanne and Lynda as well, that it really kind of boils your brains out sometimes, that it's so the level of clarity that we strive for. There is a question in the chat for the acquisitions editors about queries and and let's say proposals. What does a good proposal have? What is the tone? What information should I include? How specific? What's the length of a proposal?
The length, I would say, would vary. My advice would be, start by looking at the submission guidelines that the publisher has, and they'll probably clarify pretty much what they want to see. We asked for a cover letter in which you introduce the project, and then the proposal itself, should have a description, working table of contents, information on competitive titles, or basically some indication of what books it's in conversation with. Some nitty-gritty details. What's the state of the project? Is it almost complete and ready for submission? Is it ready for submission? Is it 2 years from being complete? Approximate word count. Do you anticipate it including any images, etc.? And so information like that is probably, some on whatever publisher you're thinking of submitting to. They probably have guidelines listing all of that stuff somewhere on their website or so. And I would also kind of reiterate something that Aurora said earlier, which is that, I think we're very open to just, a kind of an introductory query email to say, hey, I'm working on this. Do you think this is something that you might be interested in learning more about and seeing a full proposal? And that's a great way to sort of start a conversation before, while you're still putting together the proposal.
Great. Aurora? Oh, you're on mute there. Sorry.
We're good, sorry. I think another really important thing to think about is the audience of that proposal. So if it's a place where we're considering an advanced contract or, you know, really getting serious about it, yes, this proposal will be read by peer reviewers, and that is wonderful. But well before it gets to peer reviewers, it's being read by me. And I don't have a PhD, James does, but we're a real, I would say, mix in acquisitions editorial departments. We have a certain amount of expertise in what we publish, but we don't have the expertise that our authors do, especially on their, you know, very specific topic. So you're coming to us, you're also writing for our marketing department, and the chances that they have a PhD in English or whatever your field is even lower. So you really want to tell people who want to be champions of your book, but who are not experts in this subject matter, why they should care and why their audiences should care. And a lot of that is done through your description and the way that you describe how you're entering. I really like, Lynda, this dinner party metaphor, how you're entering the dinner party of whatever the sort of discipline or subfield is. So I think really thinking about audience is important, both with that query letter. You know, the query letter itself doesn't have to be the very most formal thing you've ever written, but it should still carry a certain amount of gravity and respectfulness and professionalism that shows us that you're taking this very seriously and that it's worth our time to read further. And then the proposal as well is, in some ways, it is a marketing tool that you're marketing your book even before it's been finished.
I think that's great advice. And I think one maybe way to think about part of the proposal is imagine you're writing the jacket copy in a sense, because you are, just as you have to pitch it to the acquisitions editor, at some point you have to pitch it to the reader on those little flaps there. There's a great question in the chat that kind of goes back to something Lee said about second language submissions, I guess would probably be the best way to deal with that. Can you talk a little bit more about what kinds of issues are involved with that, Lee? And is there any kind of support mechanism that anybody is aware of that would allow you know, international scholars for their ideas to be heard?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't know of any, to answer your last part first. If there are, I'd love to know about them. But the problems themselves are twofold. One is just a matter of the language, that you can, it would just need too much editing to make it something that we could publish. And that, I like to think, can be partly solved perhaps by recommending to the person that they work with someone whose first language it is.
Yeah.
I find myself hesitant to actually recommend that because I don't want to sound condescending, but maybe I should. I don't recommend that. I don't know. But the other problem, which is in some ways more serious, is a good many of the international submissions, especially from places where I'd love to publish something from. We get submissions from Iran or Jordan and, you know, Morocco, etc. But and a lot from China. A lot of the projects aren't actually all that related to what I understand is the ongoing conversation here. They are, in some sense, often old-fashioned. And, you know, it's a tricky line because you want to be open to global voices for obvious reasons. So I want to encourage that. I have the feeling that the people who sometimes submit aren't all that familiar with some of the stuff that we publish, which of course is the most obvious place to begin.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. And I would contend that in many cases, you could take the same idea and the same skeleton of an article, and you could write it to place it with 20th Century Literature or Arizona Quarterly, and then rewrite it to place it with an author journal like Suzanne and I do. It's really less about the idea than a lot of ways it is about the voice. But I think your notion of collaborating with a first language speaker, if that's the term, is a great one, because then that helps with that, get over those issues. I'm curious, that kind of leads me to a question, because I know that Suzanne and I, when we deal with submissions, we're also dealing with the idea that we are, trying to build membership in a society, and we're trying to cultivate people. And I know that we have both gone through with different projects, a lot of different rounds with writers. So Suzanne, maybe you could talk a little bit about the editing process and how long you're willing to go to get a piece in shape. And then maybe ask Lee and Lynda, are there ideas there that you're willing to take past through a second round of the revise and resubmit? Or is it 2 rounds? Is it 3 rounds? How far are you willing or able, and just to keep the journal going, to accommodate that? So Suzanne, you want to take that first?
Yeah, the Hemingway Society is an international society in a lot of ways. And Hemingway, as we know, led a life that was, invested in a lot of different places, and he traveled a lot of different places. So there are scholars all around the world with very authentic connections and interest to him. And we even have a society, Hemingway Society of Japan. And, I get incredible scholarship from Asia, from the Middle East, and sometimes even less frequently, but Central and South America. I'll go a long way to work with a strong idea from an international scholar, but that reflects, I think, a personal commitment of mine to make sure that, and this is in a way selfish about the journal and the society, I want it to be global in scope. And if that means going the extra mile with an author who needs a lot of help with the prose, I have done that. But the argument does have to Lee's point, the argument has to be appropriate to our journal, and it has to be in conversation with existing criticism. It can't be, and I've seen this too, Lee, an old fashioned type piece. But for example, we had somebody write a piece about, Hemingway's reputation in Algeria, which is incredibly complex and which I knew nothing about. And it was excellent contribution to the journal. Even if, I'm not sure if it was the case, I don't remember in that particular instance, even if I had to work on the prose, I would have done with that article, author. So again, I think, and I think Lee was reflecting the same idea. We want to be global institutions. We want to have global reach and global relevance, I think, as well. And you want to open your arms, but I think, it comes down to the argument, and then, and whether or not you're willing to go the extra mile to make sure that argument is rendered in clear prose. The only other thing I'll say is I have a friend who publishes in medieval literature, and the journal, I forget which journal she was talking to me about, but she said that they have a policy that they don't accept anybody who's not a native speaker, not a native English speaker, unless it has gone through some kind of formal review by a native English speaker first. It's not something I've been interested in instituting, it feels like it would close off opportunities for Hemingway review, but that is one policy I've heard of a journal, having something that would ask for a filter before accepting second language pieces.
Do they have their own film? I mean, how do they know?
I don't know. I didn't get that far into it. Sorry.
That's why the term going medieval means going medieval, I think. Lynda, do you want to comment on that about the revision and the rounds? And
Yes, I'd like to, and thanks for the Pulp Fiction reference. I think Lee made an extremely important distinction between facility with our English academic language conventions and our general academic conventions. And because we're an American literature grounded journal, we actually have published not enough, but we go out of our way to try to publish international authors in much the same spirit that Suzanne was so deftly outlining. We've gone through many rounds with some people because of that, the angle, the point of view, because of the contribution the individual article is making. So we'll work very hard to get the English into an idiomatic academic, idiomatic English academic prose. That said, you can't actually help in an editing, from an editing point of view. You can't handle, you can't fix, I guess, a notion of what academic writing is for that doesn't mesh with ours. And the only way that writer is going to acquire it is to be able to read a lot of stuff published in our journals. And very often that is precisely what an international scholar cannot do, right, or can't do enough of. We've gone so far as to send copies of journals to people to help them out. I don't know if we can do that these days because we moved to being published by Hopkins, but when we were a mom and pop operation, we would do that. We've received articles that demonstrate the Americanness of an author, for example. It's not an interest that our intended audience shares. But we'll definitely work with people. We'll definitely work with that prose. We are committed to that.
That's great. And what you just said kind of relates to a question that's in the chat from Marta, who's saying that she's having difficulty finding sources for her master's degree because in Italy, they just don't index. And I think the difficulty is that, it used to be before the internet, a lot of libraries kind of, you could go down and you could fish through the journals themselves. But most of those databases like MLA or JSTOR or any of those that we would go to now, the difficulty is your university has to have a subscription to be able to find copies of most of those. So I do hope we can, I know that we all the time, even though we're published by Penn State, I have no problem sending people copyrighted stuff under the table just to help them out. That brings me to Aurora and James, and a kind of question that comes up a lot in terms of manuscripts is, can you explain to us copyright and fair use, and why is it when I publish with a certain press, I have to go sell my body for $2,000 to quote somebody, or when I'm able to publish with you guys, that I can kind of get away with quoting from a primary source a lot?
We definitely don't have one size fits all answers, so I know that's why this is a question, right? We at South Carolina, because we publish on contemporary fiction, we have a lot of authors who are working with primary sources that are not in the public domain yet. And so it is something that we think about a lot. We have, I think, gone through a few iterations, and right now what I'm trying to do is to take a more expansive view of fair use and to say that within these books, you know, understanding, now I don't want to call any of them out by name and have the the publishers of those authors, you know, get too interested in what we're publishing, but books about contemporary authors, our scholarly authors are quoting from them, and if they are really demonstrating that they're using the sort of that they're not using more than they need to make the point, and that they're using this text to make an argument, and the point of this book is to, you know, analyze the works of these authors. It's not to take the place of the work of the author, of the original, you know, novelist or whoever. So we try to weigh those things. There have certainly been points where I said, you know what, you've got more than 1,000 words of block quotes from one David Foster Wallace book. I'll throw that one out there because I know we did clear that permission. And I said, you know, most of what you've done is okay. And I would say that if you can cut your quotation substantially, we could probably let it slide. However, this particular book was actually a revised and expanded version of something we published previously, and we'd already asked David Foster Wallace's publisher for permission. So it would have been a very bad look to publish a second edition and not get permission for it. So there's those kinds of considerations. I think this sort of more liberal view of fair use works a lot better with text than it does with images. It's a lot harder to get a photograph or other image that you can reproduce at the correct quality for a book for free and without clearing rights. Often you have to go to the person who owns the copyright to even get the image. So it's a lot harder to make arguments about why you should be able to use it for free, but there definitely are university presses who are pushing harder than we are on that. Duke is a leader in this sort of everything should be fair use when it comes to scholarly publishing. We think that typically private universities are more willing to do that than university presses that are tied to state institutions, because our state government doesn't want to get sued. So those are, some of the considerations.
Great. James?
Yeah, I would echo what Aurora said, and when we kind of often follow that customary guideline of 10% of a published work still falls under fair use, and so that means we can be kind of a little more relaxed with a lot of prose, full-length fiction, and nonfiction, because the percentage of the quote the percentage of the quote to the whole is so small. Where we then have to be more cautious, we find, is in poetry, where just a few lines can put you over that 10% threshold. And then we have to be even more cautious with song lyrics, where publishing companies are kind of honestly notoriously litigious. And so song lyrics are where we discourage authors from using them in epigraphs, or we ask them to get permission. And if they're quoted in the text, they really do need to be analyzed in detail, fall under that 10% threshold. And we also advise that they be run in and not set off. But yeah, song lyrics and poetry are two. And unfortunately, clearing, we have a wonderful book that just came out from a scholar in Israel on rhyme and on sporadic rhyme, what he calls sporadic rhyme in poetry. And, so he's quoting a massive amount of poetry, and it took him, I think, about 5 or 6 months to clear all of those lines, to clear all of that with people. So it's challenging.
Great. Yeah. Go ahead, Aurora. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say something else to be aware of if you do end up in a situation where you need to clear rights for whether it's prose or poetry, is that the rights for different territories may not be owned by the same party. So that was a real headache that came up for our author with this David Foster Wallace project, that he was able to get US and Canada rights pretty easily, but there were a lot of cases where the UK rights were owned by someone else, and we want to be able to sell the book in the UK and internationally, make it available, make the ebook available around the world especially. And so that it was, beginning of COVID, all of these offices were shut down. A lot of UK publishers got furloughed for a while. So it was really difficult for him to get those permissions. So just keeping in mind that, starting with the American publisher is usually, if it's an American author, is the best place to start. But there may be other rights that you need to seek elsewhere. And then also to make sure you're getting not just print rights, but also electronic rights as well.
And Suzanne can attest to this, but that the Hemingway copyright permissions are so complex because so many different entities own different chunks that, a lot of times we've ended up saying to people, you know what, there's no harm in summarizing and just, I love that you say use quotes in line rather than in block quotes, because I think that's very true. One of the things that I've seen over the years is people kind of giving a block quote and then explaining it rather than explaining the point and using the quote, as the example or the proof. So that may be one way to think of it. Okay, this is a question for everybody. I don't know if you've all seen these memes flying around on academic Twitter about Reviewer B, the infamous Reviewer B. But the question is we get reader reports back or from reviewers, and when revisions are suggested, and when one of the reviewers has recommended revisions that change the trajectory or the purpose of one's work significantly, is it professional to ask for another reviewer? Would that request even be considered? Now that's for a book manuscript, it sounds like, but I think it's a fair one to ask for the journal editors as well. Go ahead, Lynda.
I'm just going to flat out say it. It's incredibly unprofessional, absolutely abysmally unprofessional to ask for a special second reader for yourself. That's not to say that we will not listen to someone who submits an article with 2 warring reviews. We would listen to that person make a case. We even listen to that person make a case when both reviewers agree on something, and if a professional argument, professional and civil argument is offered to us, why the writer should not do it that way, I'm perfectly capable of being reviewer number 3. My managing editor is perfectly capable, more so in many ways than I am for certain manuscripts, of being reviewer number 4. It's very difficult for people trying to get published to understand what reviewers number 1, 2, 3 on ad infinitum are going through themselves, how hard they work. And actually, it's difficult for people to understand that those readers have the writer's interests at heart. I've never seen a case in which that wasn't true. We allow readers to recommend, revise and resubmit. We very rarely have let an author out of that because it's a reasonable request. Most of us have written and rewritten our own work tens of dozens of times upon occasion. So I understand. I've gotten reviews that I just tear my hair out about, more when I was younger, of course. I understand it, but your emotions are not part of the business, and that's an emotional response. Analyze what's been said about your piece, and if you actually can demonstrate in an analytical and academic and civil way that it does miss the trajectory of your argument, make the case and be prepared to hear that, well, then you should revise this essay because it is not clear that that is in fact your trajectory. We're all in this together. We really are. We're really in it to help each other reach the level of discourse we all want to participate in. This question, I'm not annoyed by it. I'm annoyed by the sheer number of people who seem to actually literally believe those memes and those jokes. That that readers are out after them, that reviewers just don't want their brilliant stuff to be published. People wouldn't be readers for journals giving up that time, giving up that energy to journals if they weren't committed to the quality of the discourse in their fields. And it is absolutely essential that there be disagreement about what makes for that quality. Or what do we got? We got, just copy an encyclopedia article, send it out.
Okay, go ahead, Lee.
Add to elaborate what Lynda's saying a bit. I'm always, in some sense, reviewing the reviewer's review. So if there's a review that I think is kind of bullshit, or hasn't really engaged the article, or whatever, I'll either, I'll get another review, and I won't send reviews to a author that I don't think are fair. Sometimes that involves acting as a reader myself. Hopefully not too often. But once I've sent those reviews, the answer is, it's not really cool to then say, ask for another review, because I've already taken seriously the job of providing what I think are fair reviews. Even going through trying to make sure that the reviews I get are good. And a lot of the times they're not, a lot of times they're just not. So,
yeah. Suzanne, did you want to add to that?
Just that point exactly, and Lynda's point that we're doing this in good faith, and we are often scanning the article before we send it out for review, and then we know when we get the reviewers back if they've got the gist of it or not. I would never send a review out that I thought just was tone deaf to what the piece was trying to accomplish. So I tend to agree that I think it's unprofessional for authors, unless there's a very extraordinary case, to ask for different reviewers, because that's already happened behind the scenes. Sorry, not screens. This can be excused for that in this age of Zoom. behind the scenes, because we are really rooting for the pieces. We want to find the right readers for them as the people who send them out to peer reviewers in the first place. So just agree 100%.
And I like what Lynda says, is that we all go through this. I mean, even those of us who've been doing this a while, I got a piece back not long ago that I was asked to write, where the reader said that I was too sympathetic to Zelda Fitzgerald and not sympathetic enough to Scott Fitzgerald in a period of time which it's very difficult to be sympathetic. And, my first thought was, why do I have to revise, right? But I also understand the process and the need to respect the process. And I honestly found when I went in and did it, there was a way to sort of balance out without, sort of either being sarcastic about it or being sort of obsequious about meeting those suggestions, of just doing it and being able to think, in what way can I take this advice and make my own topic sentences even a little better for the argument of the piece. So I think it is actually very important to understand and try and get in the mind of those readers, where they're coming from when they suggest that. Go ahead, Lynda.
Yes, brilliant. What you guys are saying, and a couple of things I forgot to add. I mean, one thing is, if that reader has misunderstood you that badly, some of that is going to be your fault, because we're not going to pick somebody off the bus who hates academics or something, as Lee very much more articulately pointed out. So it's your job to make that reader not misread you, really. They're professionals. The second thing I don't know, maybe people haven't been experiencing this, but we have had a kind of a run on people submitting things who are just royally pissed off that they don't get 2 full readers' reports no matter what we say. Desk reject, they want feedback. Reject, they want feedback. Revise and so in other words, and we've been taken to task by people who are, I think, new to the profession for not providing extensive feedback on their submission. This is a recent one, is in my mind at this point. We beat the bushes for several months trying to find people to read the piece, because it was an unusually angled piece. And both I and my managing editor read it very carefully. We did not send out full readers' reports because we were, we didn't get it back. We got comments back. There's nowhere in the contract anywhere that says we provide the kind of review that your dissertation director did not. Okay, just to be really harsh about it, and I'm doing that on purpose, that no journal owes you 2 pages of single-spaced prose about your prose.
Lynda,
It's nice when you get it, but we don't owe it to you. So.
Yeah, I
Sorry,
think
go
that's
ahead.
a little bit of a phenomenon where graduate students are told that submitting to journals is part of this formative process, and it's an educational experience, and that is true, and we try to make it that, but some of those reader reports, when I'm delivering a reject, you don't want to see. So I think we're sharing it oftentimes the best information we have to position you for further success, and we're not withholding anything that we feel could help you. I think if you just trust the journal editors to do that work for you, that would be better.
I would echo what everybody has said, that when I came into the profession, there really was a sort of I think an older generation that was still serving as readers a lot, where it was kind of the bar is up here, if I can get it in the frame, and like you either were able to jump that high or you weren't, and if you weren't, you got beaten down for it. And it took me a lot of years to really realize that readers were not out to exorcise their own angst on the submissions that they were doing, but just to get in the headspace where you can learn from them, regardless of whatever reaction you have to the response. We do have a question for the acquisition editors, and would you ever find a self-published book that is so good that you would acquire it as a second edition?
This comes up with us occasionally, more on the trade side. I don't think I've seen it on the scholarly side, but it does come up on the trade side, where someone has self-published something and they're working on revisions and they want a publishing partner. And I don't think that we have published a book from that circumstance, but we've definitely thought very hard about it. In this most recent case, it was a book that had gone through several self-published iterations, and it would be hard for us to publish exactly the same but revised book. And so we were talking about, how it could be refined and made a little bit different, and the parts that we felt were strongest, how can we highlight that and build on those things. And ultimately for the author, that just wasn't the path that they wanted to take. They decided to self-publish the new edition. So it was definitely a conversation that we were open to having for this particular book. And again, for us, a lot of times that's something regional, a regional trade title where it would make sense to do that, but I'm not sure we've actually done it.
James?
And I'm not aware that we've ever done it either. I know we did in recent years. It's not a book that I worked on, but we did basically bring out a new edition of a book that had been published by a small publisher that had then gone out of business. And so it wasn't quite a self-published book, but it was a very small print run book that was then no longer available. And it was, again, very regionally, locally oriented. And we no longer are publishing fiction, but we did used to get a lot of queries of from authors of self-published novels wanting us to bring it out. And we still have quite an extensive poetry list. But I think I get fewer queries of that nature from the poetry list. And then with poetry, you know, if we're going to consider it, inevitably, so many of the poems have already appeared in really strong journals and magazines. And if they have, then, you know, we can certainly consider bringing it out.
Great, great. All right, well, we're running out of time here, and I know people have lives to run. So I just thought I would throw open the floor for any final comments that you might have. And I guess I would ask the journal editors, is there a particular topic or theme that you, that in the journal you get maybe too many submissions on, or that there some sort of you know, issue that just is really past its prime? And I say this because I get taken to task all the time when I encourage younger folks that, you know, we get a ton of essays on The Great Gatsby, obviously, and that's, you know, that's not going to change. But I also try to tell younger people it'd be far easier for you to learn to get published by taking on one of the 180 short stories of his that nobody writes, that maybe has a new angle, as opposed to trying to do something on the American Dream, which that's, you know, for our editors, that's like a trauma trigger right there, just that term. Now that may be more an issue with the, you know, with author-based journals, but I'm just kind of curious for our journal editors, is there one sort of topic or even approach that you think we need to sort of reframe this particular issue?
There's not anything that we feels too much. I mean, we get a lot of submissions on Virginia Woolf, and I find myself thinking the bar is pretty high for a Woolf submission at this point, but I try not to. I try to be open to whatever's good and see what happens. Just want to make two more quick things if we're just
Sure.
making final comments.
Yep.
In terms of what we're looking for, you know, James and Aurora can confirm this or refine it, but I think that university presses are under certain kind of commercial pressures that, in my experience, journals are not. You know, we don't have to worry about, is this article going to sell? Because, you know, we're part of Duke University Press publications. They have subscriptions, you know, that's, you know, the subscriptions of our journal don't really rise and fall on the sellability of any individual article. So I'm especially interested in work that might have a harder time getting published in other venues because of the relative freedom from commercial pressures that journal articles, journal publishing offers. And you can imagine what those sort of articles might be. And the last thing I just want to add is, in terms of getting back to readers' reports, people should really realize that, you know, readers will really disagree over a lot of stuff in good faith. And, you know, Yeah, so what counts as a good article or not, I have my sense of things, but it's not unusual to have two very smart readers saying this is a great article or this article has no hope. And it's as a submitter, I try to keep that in mind, that this is far from a clear-cut practice.
Great. Suzanne?
Hi. Yeah, I guess so two things are on my mind as we wrap up. The first one is academic writing should be rich, but it should never feel like a slog. So if you're not enjoying yourself while you're writing and you're not pleased, like you're not feeling the sprightliness of your own prose, you need to go back and keep doing that before you submit. I think, that on the other side, publish or perish, and especially for graduate students trying to get their first jobs with the kinds of CVs that people had after 20 years in the business, ages ago. It's, I can see how if you let the stress dictate the writing, you're really just hurting yourself and you don't even realize it. So try to remember why you're doing it and feel, the joy and the passion, and let other people share in that. It's just like great teaching, great article writing really communicates with its heart, even if it's challenging or complex. So that's one thing that's on my mind as we wrap up. The other thing is that, I'm just concerned or interested about who our audience is going to be. We have referenced that higher ed is in incredible duress. English in particular is struggling. We're watching humanities disciplines be collapsed into humanities departments. And so I think one of the challenges in this in this space, is for us to start to talk honestly about who's going to read what we write. This isn't a journal writing exercise. And, where this question about the relevance of our work is something that, I think we have to reckon with in the not too distant future. And it's one of those things that, I don't think anybody has any answers, but I'd love to hear a conversation about, how are we maybe going to alter our practices or not, in the face of all these other pressures that we're seeing in our work lives. Thanks.
That's an excellent point. James and Aurora, do you guys have any closing ideas or any closing comments or words of wisdom you want to share?
Oh, I'm really touched by what Suzanne said. I think that's very well stated, that we need to think a lot about, the audiences for these books we publish. And I think at least at LSU in the recent years, we've been very actively trying to kind of grow our lists and bring in, now we're doing more in the line, we're doing more books, for example, in the line of like creative or literary nonfiction than we would have in the past, including some of these books that are written by scholars, someone who's maybe, written a couple of scholarly books and is now kind of working on a book that is drawing on their scholarly work, but maybe in more of a like memoir or creative fashion. And so I think that there's some really interesting work in that vein going on in the field, and it's something that I'm interested in kind of staying open-minded about and being on the lookout for.
Great, thank you. Aurora?
I think that audience question is so important. We think a lot about what different audiences we're serving. So within the state of South Carolina, especially looking at those trade audiences, and a lot of people who start out with scholarship and then move on to something that is more public facing. So that's definitely an area of growth. But then also thinking about what we can do as university presses to support instructors in the classroom, and what we can do that makes sense in our space as opposed to what's done in commercial publishing, because there is a big difference between what you can do with the resources of a textbook publisher versus a university press. So to try to figure out what it is that that scholars and teachers need. And I think people who are earlier in their career and are really deep in that everyday teaching world have a lot to offer in terms of thinking about what directions we should be going in. So I'm excited to sort of all work together as a community to make sure that we're reaching audiences who need us in the years to come.
Great, great. Thank you. I would just echo what everybody has said. And I think the two areas that we can be in a lot of ways most vital and resuscitate the profession is in teaching and teaching materials, but also in public engagement. And so, any kind of outreach that we can do where I do believe there's an audience out there for, a literary conversation. People want to know the history of our literary heritage and are intrigued by ideas. And I think we just need to find where they are and maybe reach out beyond the bonds of our own circles a little further in order to do that. So I want to thank everybody for their time. Go ahead, Lynda.
I just a brief last word, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yes.
I want to endorse absolutely what all y'all have been saying. That and they're quite, what you're expressing is quite beautiful in the face of the tsunami of horribles that we are all facing in this profession. I want to hike it down a little bit to a couple of practical suggestions for people who are still afloat in that tsunami. On a very, very practical level, one of the publishing conventions that we have now, almost all of us, is that an author needs to provide an abstract of an article. It's an extremely difficult thing to do, but if you can't write an abstract for your article, you haven't finished writing your article. So just try. Point. It's not a picayune detail. It's really important. Secondly, one of the things Arizona Quarterly faces on the regular is that somebody heard that we publish single author articles. And then we get a kind of 1960s Southern agrarian close reading of an article of an author, often one nobody's ever heard of. So keep in mind again that there has to be a net. Indra's net has to be a part of what you're thinking about, that dinner table conversation. And it should be a very expansive dinner table. I absolutely agree with what y'all are saying. And finally, if you want to be new but also accessible, if you want to offer something to conversation, try a little bit of recombinant thinking. So join two conversations that a person typically doesn't join at the same time in your work. Don't just do, I'm going to add cognitive scientist to my neuroscientists, try throwing in a gardener or something, try surprising combinations, both methodologically and literarily, is something that absolutely delights me. And I think that is a kind of a proposition for going forward that our increasingly beleaguered communities might do well to try to foster.
Excellent, excellent. Those are great practical pieces of advice. Well, I can't thank the five of you enough. You've all been very gracious with your time, and I thank everybody for tuning in and posing their questions. And the only thing I would say in closing is I look at my own experience, and it took me a long time to get anything written that I could stomach, and even longer to get anything published. So, the forces are kind of geared against you to give up. And I think the best advice that any of us could give is just to keep doing it and be aware of the steps that you can take practically that can make your writing better. And I think a lot of the great advice here today has centered on very practical and purposeful pieces of advice. So on that note, we are going to symbolically, the Fitzgerald Society is going to symbolically hand off the baton to the Hemingway Society, which now has 4 Fridays in a row of absolutely excellent programming to tune into, which I look forward to just sitting back and watching rather than running. And I just want to say, Suzanne, it's always a delight to work with you, and James, Aurora, it is always an honor to be able to have a conversation with you. And Lee, thank you so much for your time. And Lynda, my apologies about the time zone confusion. That was, sometimes I get confused about what time I'm supposed to start in Central. But thank you for everything you do. And we should mention that that Lynda, just because I didn't get a chance to do her intro, is a James scholar and wrote a great book called Henry James, The Web of Experience, and also co-edited the MLA Approaches to Teaching Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, which I can attest to is absolutely essential to bringing that class alive in the classroom. So thank you all, and thank you there, and we shall talk to you all very soon.
Thank you, Kirk. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.